Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 151. This week the questions are taken from Guide 209 to the Danish ship Rolf Krake and the accompanying Wednesday video, which is part of the Guadalcanal campaign series about the Battle of Cape Esperance. Lord Wintertown asks, could the British have built and operated the Vickers 2-pounder pom-poms and fired a high-explosive distance fused shell like Italian, Japanese and Russian operated 2-pounder mounts? And relatedly, how many octuple 2-pounder pom-pom mounts were present on C-class anti-aircraft cruisers, as I seem to see conflicting results all over the place? So as far as variably timed fuse, and that's actual variable time fuse as opposed to VT fuse, which was the cover for proximity fuse, but never mind. So in terms of time fuse 40mm rounds for the pom-poms, some of the British pom-poms did have this functionality, the earlier models. This was removed in later models, or I guess just not included, for reasons that would need a considerably longer explanation than can be supplied here. But the short answer is yes, it could be done. It just wasn't for the sort of high velocity round-equipped pom-pom mounts that made up most of the World War II armament of British cruisers and battleships. But some part of it, according to documents that I've seen, was that they were concerned about the rate of increase in speed of aircraft. So when the earlier mounts were around, they were only having to deal with relatively slow-flying biplanes and such. By the time you get to the 30s and then into World War II, aircraft are operating a lot quicker, so bearing is changing quicker, range is changing quicker, and there are some concerns expressed as to whether or not this is having these fuses is a good idea, because it means that, let's say you see an aircraft coming in and you set your fuse for 3,000 yards. Well, a fast aircraft that's attacking you, a fast monoplane, is only going to be in that 3,000 yard bracket for a very short amount of time. So if you're changing this setting on the mounting constantly, the chances are you're going to either not do it quickly enough or you're going to get the range estimation wrong. What you really need is an automatic way of changing the fuse setting, probably based on what your anti-aircraft fire control system is telling you is the correct range. And that element is significantly more complicated than just having a fuse setter installed on the mount. And as far as how many pom-poms were equipped on the C-class anti-aircraft cruiser conversions, it is not a contradiction that there are conflicting figures, because different ships had different numbers of pom-poms installed. And that's simply a factor of when they're modified. The earliest modifications were Coventry and Curlew, and I mean their AA fit is completely different to Curacao, Cairo, Carlisle and Calcutta, and that's different again to the relatively unmodified C-class cruisers, the ones that weren't turned into full anti-aircraft cruisers but were still around for the Second World War, because the earliest versions, obviously the fit learned from their experience to a certain degree. That's why the later ones, amongst other reasons, used dual mount 4-inch guns instead of single 4-inch. But also in 1936, when Coventry and Curlew are being modified, there's not the wartime pressure of production. So the Royal Navy, if they want to have a decent heavy anti-aircraft battery and a decent medium anti-aircraft battery, they can afford to do that. They have the time, they have the production. Whereas once you're getting into the run-up to war and wartime itself, the demands to fit pom-poms to all sorts of ships, including the King George V's, etc., all the new ships that are coming into service, and a lot of them are coming into service at an increased rate, and there's obviously a lot more being built, plus in reinstalling or reinstalling new or refitting pom-poms in older ships that aren't the C-class, like Renown or the County class, for example, because they realise they need more anti-aircraft defence. And so in all of that, there is a shortage of 40mm pom-poms. And so whilst there may be this is what we ideally would like to fit, there's more of a, well, this is what we actually have that we can fit at the time, so having a little bit of something is better than nothing. So you see the 1939 and wartime C-class conversions have fewer pom-poms, but that's not because they didn't want to have fewer 40mm anti-aircraft guns, it's simply because they didn't have enough. And whilst converting them to anti-aircraft cruisers was a worthy goal, the general view was that if you've only got one 40mm octuple mount, it's better for that to go on something that will be really, really, really expensive if you lost it, like a battleship, rather than something that, like a 4,000 or 5,000 ton C-class, which, whilst losing it is not ideal, is not going to sting anywhere near as much as, a full-on capital ship. And so things vary even during the war. As you see on pretty much all Royal Navy ships, the anti-aircraft batteries vary considerably as guns are hot swapped out for repairs, refits, reassignment to other ships, and new ones are brought back in, and you get this medley of 20mm, 40mm pom-pom and 40mm Bofors developing. Titanback asks, could the Norwegian ships Eidsvol and Norge win against the German forces at the Battle of Narvik? Win as in destroy all 10 German destroyers? I don't think so, to be perfectly honest. Possibly force a withdrawal by taking out a fair number of them? Yeah, they could probably do that. But it depends somewhat on luck and a lot on circumstances. Now, if you watch the video that I did on the battles of Narvik, you'll notice that one of the things that really did in for Eidsvol and Norge was the fact that there was such horrific weather, the Germans were basically right on top of them. And, okay, yes, there's also command and control issues about whether or not they're even going to fire on the Germans, but assuming for the moment, for the sake of argument, that the Norwegians are willing to fire on the Germans before the Germans, at point-blank range and can just torpedo them, just looking at effectively the on-paper stats, they are still outnumbered quite considerably. Now, there is a trailing German destroyer, but 4.5 to 1 or 5 to 1, it's rather an academic issue, to be honest. With the weather the way it was, there's no way Eidsvol and Norge can substantially destroy any large number of German ships before they're overwhelmed. The ranges are just too close. They're optimal for fast melee fighting destroyers. But if the weather had been perfectly calm and crystal clear, and the two ships had been able to mutually support each other, and they're able to just fire all straight down the Narvik fjord at the oncoming Germans the minute they show themselves, which obviously does require a certain degree of change in the mindset of the Norwegian commanders as well, then they do have some advantages. They do have considerably more firepower per ship than the Germans do. Their heavier guns are longer range and would carry considerable stopping power if they hit the German ships. The German ships are also slightly complicated by having to carry the troops for the invasion force and such, so as was seen with Blucher when it was sunk by Oscaborg Fortress, having the troops, it makes it slightly more crowded, and casualty counts from any hit is going to be quite horrific, but also there are supplies for troops aboard which are not able to be stored deep down in the ships and tend to be somewhat flammable. So hits from the two Norwegian ships would cause significantly more issues for the destroyers, even than being hit by an 8-inch or 6-inch shell would have caused for the destroyers anyway. So if their gun crews had been nice and on the ball that day, they've effectively got a shooting gallery, so at long range that mitigates the Germans' ability to evade substantially. So at that range, it's possible. If they roll the dice well and they disable or destroy 3 or 4 German ships, it's possible that they could win in as much as the German vessels would probably then withdraw rather than press the attack in the face of the ongoing casualties. However, it's also entirely possible that the gunnery might not be that effective. They might hit, sink, or disable one or two ships whilst the Germans press the attack, and as the historical Battle of Narvik showed, these ships are old enough they do not have any substantial torpedo protection. So German torpedoes, once they get close enough, the ships are not exactly fast and they're confined, the same as the German vessels would be, which would render them sunk in relatively short order. Plus, once you close the range down a bit, the rapid fire from the German vessels would probably clear the decks of a lot of Norwegian sailors. So, yes, in theory, it's possible to construct a scenario where a slightly more aggressive Norwegian commander with a good set of weather circumstances could have forced the Germans to withdraw and thus win the battle. But it's not, even in those circumstances, it's not a guaranteed thing. It could go the Germans' way still. Armando Matos asks, in some losses during wartime, ships like Lexington, HMAS Canberra or SMS Lutzow were ultimately sent to the bottom or assisted on their way to the bottom by their own side. However, they're always referred to as sunk by enemy action without much debate. Why does Bismarck spark such a debate about who sent it to the depths? I've looked at this in some previous dry docks to a certain degree, but to sort of collate everything here, I guess, at least in the short form, I will be covering this at some point in the future in much more detail, but I think it's a combination of a few different factors. One of the main ones, ironically enough, is people actually buying into the propaganda from both sides. For Germany, obviously, it's relatively understandable. This was their biggest ship. It was their most heavily armed ship, etc. It was sort of the pride of their navy. So wartime German propaganda played it up as, this is the big, best battleship on the planet. Then you enter the Allied propaganda, and the Allied propaganda was pretty much almost as bad as the German. In part because, it's wartime, so if you play up that the enemy is really big and scary and terrible and powerful, then that increases the support for people going, yes, well, we should destroy this horrifically terrible and powerful enemy in case he comes for us. Plus, there's also the propaganda value of if your enemy is really big and scary, then when you inevitably destroy him, that makes you look a lot better, and a lot more heroic. And to a certain extent, that's kind of the pre-Operation Rheinübung propaganda. And then once you get the actual operation going on and Hood is sunk, then again it's kind of Hood was the pride of our fleet, it's been sunk by this ship, ergo this ship must be really big and powerful and scary and fantastic, otherwise it couldn't possibly have sunk our flagship. That's kind of the reasoning behind the propaganda. So you have both Allied and German propaganda during the war really overblowing the capabilities of the Bismarck-class battleships. And then, after the war, far too many people believe it, uncritically, without analysing it. And as I've said before, the Bismarck-class are not terrible warships. A terrible warship is a warship that would lose in a straight-up fight to pretty much anything that could even remotely be called a peer. The Bismarck class are not that. They are terribly engineered warships in terms of design efficiency, but their massive displacement relative to the other treaty ships kind of makes up for that. But as I've said before, it's kind of your scenario of, well, if you take a decentish, like mid to mid upper tier heavyweight boxer and then you put him in the ring with featherweights or middleweights and he does relatively well, that's not exactly a mind-blowing credit to him. It's you can stand your ground against people who are half your size. Well done. You're not a complete incompetent. And it's pretty much the same thing with Bismarck. Bismarck sits competitively-ish within the realm of the treaty battleships, Richelieu, King George V, South Dakota, North Carolina, etc. And it sits in that category. It can take a good fight to pretty much all of them. It's not going to definitively lose outright to any of them easily, but the fact that it's so much heavier and, it can only give these ships a fair fight is kind of a big mark against it from an engineering perspective. But that's a little bit of a digression. Anyway, back to the original question. So, bearing all of that in mind, when Bismarck is sunk, because it's been played up as this really massive, powerful uber ship, people sometimes have a little bit of difficulty in accepting that it could be sunk by anything. And the fact that it took such a battering, people sort of go, oh yes, well, it took so many shells and none of them managed to sink it, therefore it couldn't have been sunk by those shells. Forgetting, of course, that I think it gets conflated with Hood. They forget that not every battle ends in the catastrophic detonation of a ship after a few minutes. I mean, heck, look at Kirishima. No one's going to argue that Kirishima is an especially heavily armoured or invincible battleship. In fact, as you already know, most of you, I refuse to call them battleships. They are battle cruisers. They're refitted battle cruisers, but they're still battle cruisers. And Kirishima takes an absolute pounding at the hands of USS Washington at the Naval Battle of Guadalcanal. It gets completely ripped apart. There's flooding all over the place. Everyone realises this. But Kirishima takes longer to sink than Bismarck. Not in terms of, time taken to throw shells at her, but from the time that the first shell is fired at her to the time that she sinks, Kirishima's afloat for an awful lot longer than Bismarck. Now, granted, Kirishima's not hit by torpedoes, and torpedoes are something Bismarck was hit considerably more by, and, making holes in the top of a ship is not a particularly efficient way of sinking it. Making big holes in the bottom is. But you end up, therefore, with this kind of, I guess, semi-hypocritical stance of Bismarck took a massive amount of shells and didn't sink immediately, therefore must be insanely tough. Bismarck also sank far faster than any capital ship in the World War I, World War II era almost that didn't suffer from a catastrophic magazine detonation. Therefore, rather than conflate the two and go, right, well, it sank fairly quickly because it took this massive pounding of shells and torpedoes, people conclude that the only reason it could have sunk is because it was scuttled. And then you get into the whole issue, again, something that I need to do a complete video about to explain in more detail, with the survivors' reports. And you obviously have people like Officer Junak, who's the engineering officer, who says that the ship was scuttled, and says that he set the scuttling charges, he got an order to scuttle, etc. And you have one or two others backing him up. But then when you look at the survivors' accounts as a whole, there's massive contradictions between that testimony and the testimony of other fairly reliable officers who are aboard the ship. The timelines don't match up, so someone's not telling the truth, but who is it? People who are devoted to the idea of Bismarck being this uber ship that could only be sunk by its own crew will just laser focus in on, oh no, the engineering officer said he was ordered to scuttle, he said he scuttled it, therefore it was scuttled. Other people who are not particularly attached to that narrative will look at the wider picture and say, oh, actually, there's a bunch of contradictions, so we can't necessarily be sure. And then on top of that, you get all this stuff about the wreck and people reporting and in some cases misreporting what various people said about the wreck and what evidence they did and didn't find on the wreck. Spoiler alert, Bismarck is almost up to its waterline in mud. You're not going to be seeing any significant evidence of torpedo strikes or scuttling charges at the lower parts of the ship because they're all in mud. The propellers are fractionally exposed at the back, but most of the hull is quite deeply embedded. So unless someone wants to get a 3.5 mile long dredger unit, that particular element of things is never going to be completely resolved. And then you've got stuff like, oh, well, it doesn't show any signs of implosion damage. Spoiler alert, neither does USS Johnston, and no one's arguing Johnston was scuttled. And so you get this back and forth of people trading barbs even to this day of, was it scuttled, was it not scuttled, does the evidence support it, does the evidence not support it, is the evidence somewhat agnostic on the subject? And I think it's all grown out of that initial propaganda mixed with some rather interesting perceptions on exactly what makes a ship sink, and it's just kind of grown from there and taken on a mythos of its own. But this is a question is getting on quite a bit. Andres Caraballo asks, were coastal defence ships capable of deterring full-blown battleships from coming in and accomplishing a gunboat diplomacy? It depends an awful lot on, once again, the navy in question, and also the navy that's coming after you. Possibly also to a degree whether it's war, peace, or people are considering war. Now, not all coastal defence ships are created equal. With the best will in the world to the Royal Thai Navy, the Thonburi was never going to deter a battleship. It might have deterred a light cruiser, but I would struggle to see how it would deter even a heavy cruiser, let alone a full-on battleship. But that's not a fault of it as a ship in and of itself. It is limited to the size, displacement, and armament it was given. You know, if you give a ship a few 6-inch guns, you can't expect it to deter a battleship. And when you look at the various coastal defence battleships in the Scandinavian countries, you see big differences there as well. Eidsvol and Norge combined could probably deter a cruiser of most descriptions in a fjord fight, but again, they're not going to deter a battleship. Väinämöinen and Ilmarinen, on the other hand, possibly, especially operating in the environment they were designed for in the various islands and inlets around Finland. And the Sverige class, we know from Kriegsmarine documents, did have a deterrent effect on at least the Scharnhorsts. If the Kriegsmarine had had the Bismarcks at the time, I don't think even the Sveriges would have necessarily completely deterred them, but they did have a deterrent effect on the Kriegsmarine when their heaviest warship was Scharnhorst. So you've got to have a powerful enough coastal defence ship to start with. If you are talking about a proper coastal defence ship as opposed to just a short-range battleship, then you probably also have to have more of them. So that's why all of these classes have more than one ship, and in some cases more than two. And then you've got to consider the navy coming after you. So if you have 2 or 3 coastal defence ships that are relatively capable, and your enemy has, say, between 1 and 4 battleships of reasonable firepower, there may very well be a defensive value there, especially if your opponent has other concerns they might need to worry about. Because even if they've got 4 capital ships, chances are they can only maybe bring 2 to bear at any one time, and if they've got other nations to worry about, i.e. it's not taking place in a vacuum, then even the loss of 1 or the heavy damage of 1 could be quite serious for your opponent's strategic situation. Therefore, the deterrent value is affected. Whereas if you are talking about a fleet that has a dozen or more battleships, then they're probably not going to be awfully that much deterred, because 1, the loss of any one battleship of their own is going to be significantly less effect on their fleet, but 2, they can just show up with massive amounts of firepower to near enough guarantee they're not going to lose a battleship, because they can just smother you in explosives until you go away. So that's the scaling issue of both sides, your coastal defence ships and how many capital ships your opponent has. The other aspect is this peace versus war thing. In wartime, actually, I think the deterrent effect increases because it is going to be a shooting engagement. There is a possibility of ships being lost. In peacetime, gunboat diplomacy, well, it's not normally done by battleships, but if it was, I don't think most coastal defence ships of the size, scale and numbers that were historically used would have all that much effect on someone who's doing gunboat diplomacy, because most nations who actually practiced that were nations that had these massive fleets. And so, short of chaining your ships together across the harbour to try and stop them coming in, because it's not a shooting environment straight up, and therefore the enemy has less strategic concerns, they can afford to show up locally with overwhelming firepower. Now, they might respect your sovereignty a little bit more. The terms that they're imposing might be fractionally less harsh, but at the end of the day, if your opponent is the kind of navy that has the size to practice gunboat diplomacy in the first place, any reasonable number of coastal defence ships probably aren't going to stop them. If they might not come after you in the first place with sort of enforced gunboat diplomacy, but that is probably more to do with the fact that you're a nation that has the size and industry and capability to support coastal defence ships of some capability in the first place, rather than the existence of the ships themselves. Because the implications of a nation with that kind of wealth and industry have a direct impact on how successful the or else part of gunboat diplomacy could be enforced and how much that would cost. Fizzy Boot asks, both before and after Midway, Japan sought a decisive naval battle against the US Navy. Why didn't they send their entire fleet, including battleships and carriers, against Guadalcanal? The battleships could have bombed Henderson Field, making it unusable, whilst the carriers gave air cover. The US Navy would then have been forced to either fight or lose control over Guadalcanal. In part, this is because it was more of an escalating engagement. They didn't expect the US forces to land so quickly in the first place, and when they initially did, they thought they'd be able to take them out again fairly quickly. Plus some rather, shall we say, overly optimistic estimates from the Japanese army didn't help with that. So by the time it became clear that actually this was going to be quite the long haul, quite the slog, then the Japanese pretty much actually did exactly what you suggest. That's what the Battle of the Santa Cruz was all about. The Japanese sent in pretty much every available fleet carrier they had left after Midway, plus some smaller ones, plus they sent in a very powerful heavy surface force. The only things they really didn't send in were their full-on battleships. And to be honest, given what they knew of the US forces in the region, they didn't need to. And sending in anything other than Yamato would have slowed them down. And even Yamato would have slowed them down slightly because the Congos were faster. But you could probably get away with doing that, but as far as they knew, the American forces in the region, and correctly, as far as the intel actually worked out, were primarily the carrier forces. There were some US surface forces, including the odd battleship in the escorts, but given the preponderance of carriers that the Japanese were sending, plus the massive amounts of surface forces they were sending, including the four Congos, they had no reason to think that they'd need to commit anything else. That was, on paper, an overwhelming force already, and basing ships all the way down there, it did stretch logistics somewhat, because you've got to get all their food, fuel and supplies to Rabaul for them to restock before they head into the combat area. The Americans are on near enough the same kind of restriction, although Australia is there. Part of the reason why there aren't more American ships in the region is because there's a certain bottleneck on the amount of fuel and supplies that they can stage forward to the Guadalcanal combat area. Now, yeah, you can probably make the argument that if they'd sent in the Nagatos and maybe the Isseis and Fusos as well, if they really want to completely overdo it, then you could have the Battle of Santa Cruz going on at the same time as this powerful, slow battleship force goes and completely flattens Henderson Field. But bearing in mind Midway, Coral Sea, Pearl Harbor, etc., the Japanese, as much as anybody, are just perfectly aware of how powerful aircraft can be when it comes to destroying capital ships. They don't think they need it because the Congos can do an equally good job of flattening Henderson Field once they're finished off the US fleet, or so the thinking goes. And so putting slower and therefore more vulnerable ships up as potential targets in an environment where the Japanese think they're going to win anyway, therefore the risk is not necessary. In hindsight, you could probably say, yeah, it might have been a good idea, but even then, you've got to remember the Cactus Air Force would have had something to say about, a whole squadron of Japanese battleships trying to shoot up their home. Plus, by the time of Santa Cruz, you're also looking at US torpedo boats, PT boats, etc., based in and around the area. So there would have been hazards operating battleships in those confined waters, which both sides fully appreciated. And so there are a lot of factors at the time as to why the Japanese didn't send in everything and the kitchen sink. But as noted at Santa Cruz, they did pretty much send in everything you could reasonably expect them to. It just didn't quite work out for them the way they thought. Roberto Gonzalez asks, wasn't there any location for the Japanese to build a airfield closer to the Guadalcanal operational area than Rabaul, which would have allowed them to contest American local air superiority to a greater extent? In theory, yes, and they did try on Bougainville, one of the northernmost, if not the northernmost, of the Solomon Island chain. However, they did run into problems. The reason it wasn't completed, there are various operational reasons, but one of the bigger ones was American interference, rather understandably. Basically, the problem was with Rabaul was far enough away that unless the Americans staged forward aircraft or tried a carrier strike or something, it was pretty much out of reach of the vast majority of US forces. So they could operate there quite nice and peacefully for the most part, with the relatively little to worry about. They could develop and expand the airbase, and it's a little bit closer to where they're getting all their supplies from. Then there's this stretch of water between Rabaul and the bulk of the Solomon Island chains. It's not the majority of the distance between Rabaul and Guadalcanal, certainly, but by the time you've transitioned it and you're now in the Solomon's Island chains, you have the problem that you have now entered the vicinity of American air cover. Now, not all American aircraft could range the full length of the Eastern Solomon Islands chains in an operational sense, but if you have an airfield, it's a fixed target, it's a known location, you only need to worry, if you're an American aircraft, about there and back with some reserve, especially if you're the strike aircraft. And so if you build an airfield in this area, you are going to be constantly under American attack. Your supply ships are going to be constantly under American attack. The aircraft on the ground are going to be constantly under American attack. And that's basically what happened when they tried to establish an airbase there. Whereas with Rabaul, they could exploit the fact that everything down to their fighters, like the Zero, had an incredibly long combat range compared to American aircraft. So they could strike at targets just on Guadalcanal without having to worry about the Americans being able to follow them all the way home. Now, it does lead to its own issues about the fact that your pilots will have been up in the air for a fair bit of time before they arrive over the target. So that has its issues with, fatigue, etc. Coordination is a problem. Being spotted at coming over such long distances is an issue. But ultimately, between the Americans making very sure that they couldn't establish an airfield closer, and the rather understandable benefits of operating in an environment where you don't have to worry about a Dauntless or a B-17 showing up over your head every 5 minutes, the Japanese ended up basically basing out of Rabaul anyway. And bearing in mind, Henderson Field was the airfield on Guadalcanal that everyone was fighting over. So they did appreciate the idea of having an airfield there. It's just, well, they didn't have the one that was operational, even despite their best efforts to take it. F12MNB asks, could you comment on notable changes in command? Not just this particular one, obviously referring to the Guadalcanal series where Halsey replaces Gormley, but the relief of Fletcher, and why was Cunningham relieved from the Mediterranean? Some of it's down to politics. In fact, an awful lot of it is down to politics, just as much as capability. And sometimes also operational circumstances change. So, for example, Admiral Cunningham, when he was relieved of being Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, that happened at a time where he'd pretty much got done, mission accomplished. He'd held off the Italians for several years. He'd supervised Operation Torch. He'd been part of Operation Husky. The Italians were out of the war. One of his last major signals before he was relieved of that command was to tell everyone the Italian fleet was under the guns of Malta. There was still stuff to do in the Mediterranean, but there wasn't a massive enemy fleet to fight. And even so, I think Cunningham probably would have been able to successfully lobby to, stay in the Mediterranean. He'd been promoted to Admiral of the Fleet and still stayed in the Mediterranean earlier. But Admiral Pound, who at that point had been First Sea Lord, had died, and they needed someone to be First Sea Lord. And, well, who else were you going to choose at that point other than Cunningham? So he was needed to head up basically the entire Royal Navy war effort. That did mean taking him out of an operational command, which he really didn't like. But needs of the service, needs of the nation above personal preference. I'm sure Admiral Cunningham would have loved to stay in operational command of a battle fleet, and if he'd got his way, I'm pretty sure he would have been leading the British Pacific Fleet up against the Japanese, or anything. I mean, he would have been just as probably happy on Duke of York taking out on Scharnhorst, but he needed to be in charge of the Royal Navy, so he was in charge of the Royal Navy. Fletcher, I think, is definitely a political decision more than an operational one. Fletcher's command style is very different to Halsey. Halsey is big, brash, and aggressive, and later on it sometimes does get the better of him. Fletcher is much more calculated and reserved, but with Halsey being given general command of, the US big carrier strike force as it builds up, he is going to always clash with Fletcher. And so once Fletcher is relieved of that particular command of the carriers, the odds of Halsey wanting someone with such a diametrically opposed attitude on carrier command near him or under him is, it's not going to work. And between that and the politics of the situation, with all the accusations that are flung left, right and centre, some with a little bit of accuracy, some with basically none, about Fletcher, he ends up not being in, say, place of someone like Admiral Mitscher. And you do see the reverse of this towards the end of the war, after the almost debacle of the Battle of Leyte Gulf, followed by the two typhoons. Admiral King, by all accounts, seems to have, after the first typhoon, seems to have seriously been considering relieving Halsey of command. But even after the second typhoon, when King's pretty much, I think this needs to be done, the politics of the situation prevent that, because whilst Halsey is causing an unnecessary loss of life and unnecessary risk to US forces, King at that point is balancing that against the morale impact of taking Halsey away from the fleet, because his public image and his image with the servicemen is somewhat different to a cold analysis of his operational successes and failures. And cold-hearted as it might sound, King basically makes the estimation that the US can afford at least for the moment, to take the hits, the potentially unnecessary hits that it's taking as a result of having Halsey in command of the carrier strike force, as opposed to the loss of efficiency, the loss of morale, and therefore the potentially greater losses that might occur should Halsey be relieved. K Wolf X asks, looking at the 4 days battle of 1666 and other naval battles of the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and naval battles of the wars of Louis XIV, I noticed that there were often 40, 50, or 70 or even more ships of the line listed as combatants per side. Plus, fleets would bring up to a dozen ships listed as frigates, maybe a bunch of dispatch ships, and numerous fire ships. 100 years later, during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars, it's rare to see major naval battles where there are more than 30 ships of the line on each side, and far fewer ships of the line in many battles. Why this discrepancy in the number of major combatants? There were two main aspects to this. One was the simple increase in size, complexity, and cost of ships that you had by the time of the Napoleonic Wars. So, for example, if you look at the top 5 English or British warships in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, and you look at their displacement and their armament, you'll notice that they're somewhere between 50 and 80 guns, unless you're looking at Sovereign of the Seas, and they measure about 1,000 to 1,200, maybe up to 1,400 tons burthen, again, unless you're looking at Sovereign of the Seas. Tons burthen is a slightly different measure of displacement than, tons of displacement, but regardless, fortunately for Napoleonic-era warships, we also have their tons burthen displacements for a number of vessels. And of course, some of those guns were also a bit lighter than some of the heavier guns that were carried in Napoleonic-era ships of the line. So then you get to a Napoleonic-era ship of the line, you look at something like HMS Victory, which is not the biggest ship of the line, first-rate ship of the line present in, say, the Battle of Trafalgar or in the Napoleonic Wars, but it's a good a good reference point. Now, Victory weighs or displaces or has a displacement of about twice the amount of tons burthen compared to the leading ships in the Royal Navy in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And obviously, with 104 guns, is considerably more heavily armed as well. So it's a much bigger, much more expensive vessel, and that means there's going to be fewer of them. And bearing in mind, we're comparing the top ships, so the lesser ships that are involved in the fight in the Anglo-Dutch Wars are going to be 30, 40, maybe pushing into 50 gun vessels. And the Dutch generally have smaller vessels than the Royal Navy does. And then so compare that to a Napoleonic era ship of the line fight where you're talking about 74 guns basically being the price of entry. By that point, the 64 gunner was kind of on its way out. And you've got 80 gunships, 98 gunships, 104 gunships, 112 gunships, 144 gunships in the case of the Centesma Trinidad, and so on and so forth. And so if the ship is a lot larger and costs a lot more to build, there's going to be fewer of them, just on principle. But there is a second factor, which is that most of the Napoleonic-era naval battles take place against fleets that have to be dispersed across most of the world's oceans. So there's not the opportunity to bring together the kinds of sizes of forces that you see in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, even though, technically speaking, some of the navies involved in the Napoleonic Wars could actually have done so. Whereas, say, in the Anglo-Dutch Wars, well, clues in the name who they're being fought between, but they're basically being fought almost entirely in the North Sea and the English Channel, which means that the two navies can throw practically all of their strengths at each other without having to worry too much about overseas commitments, although there are a few ships on both sides that are wandering around other parts of the world. Whereas when you look at the Napoleonic Wars, if you take the Royal Navy as an example, they're going to be fighting the French and at various points the Spanish in the Mediterranean, so they've got to keep ships in there. There's usually a blockade of some kind going on, so there's ships assigned to that. There's ships that are kept at home. There's ships that are kept on foreign stations in the Caribbean and in Canada, keeping an eye partly on the US and partly on French and Spanish holdings over there. You've got warships operating in the Indian Ocean. You've got a few warships operating in the Pacific, although not that many, to be fair. And you have a lot more warships on general roving duties than you do in the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And so, because of the extensive period of warfare that you see in the latter part of the 1700s and the early 1800s, the navies have grown to a size where if you look on kind of their overall orders of battle, you could actually put together fleets of a similar size to those you see in some of the wars or the battles of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. They're just all over the place, and you have individual fleets which are therefore smaller. So, for example, during the Trafalgar campaign, you have Nelson and his fleet chasing the Franco-Spanish fleet, but when the Franco-Spanish fleet is ahead of him running back east across the Atlantic from the Caribbean, they run into Admiral Calder's fleet. So that's an entirely separate British fleet made up of ships of the line. Now, if you combined Nelson's squadron pursuing, or Nelson's fleet pursuing, with Admiral Calder's fleet pursuing, or fleet blocking at the English Channel, you'd actually have an overall fleet that's approaching the size, not quite, but approaching the size of some of the larger battles of the Anglo-Dutch Wars. And then if you took a couple of other Royal Navy fleets that were operating in that same kind of northern Atlantic Mediterranean hemisphere, and added those in, you could have quite easily in 1805 a British fleet that was 80, 90 ships of the line strong. But that would leave Britain's interest in a good chunk of its oceanic areas of interest completely unguarded, and so that's why they didn't do that. And pretty much the same situation for a lot of the Franco-Spanish efforts as well. Warren Jervey asks, the taking of prizes by Royal Navy ships during the Age of Sail seems to have been a lucrative source of income for officers and men. Did the Royal Navy keep historical records such that a top 3 list of prizes could be compiled? And if so, who or what would fall into that top 3, looking at overall career prize takings by an individual ship, captain or crew, prize takings in a single battle, voyage or campaign, or most valuable prize or group of prizes taken in a single battle? Well, every award of prize money had to be kept as a record for the Admiralty Court. So yes, those records are possible to compile if you happen to want to do so. I do not have the time to do so. I don't know, maybe somebody might have done in the past, who knows. But as a result, I can't point to a sort of a top 3 for each individual one of those categories. Although there may well be a historian who has actually gone through and done all of that work, which would be, I say, quite considerable. However, if you want to look at some of the ones that are almost certainly going to get into that top prize section, as you will have seen from the video on HMS Indefatigable a while ago, she took a lot of ships with a fair amount of valuable prize money gathered. So she's probably in the contention for top 3 Royal Navy vessels and possibly naval vessels, period, in terms of career value. In terms of individual value per voyage, see, this is the thing. A lot of it depends on the status of the nation and the economy at the time, because when you're talking about sort of prize taking and prize money awarded, etc., you can be looking at anything from kind of the Tudor period through to the end of the Napoleonic Wars. And in terms of absolute overall value, you probably want to look at Sir Francis Drake's Round the World voyage, because the amount of money that he came back with at that point, although you could argue potentially later voyages or later series of voyages or careers might have netted more as total worth, as compared to its impact at the time, it was by far, I think, probably the largest. For example, bearing in mind that there were multiple investors into Drake's voyage, and he got to keep a bunch of it for himself, Just the money that Queen Elizabeth I received was enough to pay off the entire British, or English at that point, yes, English, because we hadn't had we didn't have the dual monarchs at that point, so it paid off the entire English national debt, plus money left over sufficient to found a fairly substantial merchant company, plus still more left over from various other bits and pieces. And that was just the Queen's share, let alone everybody else's. Now, to give you some idea of roughly how much that would be the equivalent to these days, as of last year, the UK's national debt was about 1.8, or coming up to 1.9 trillion pounds. So that's the equivalent of a Royal Navy warship rocking up with about £2 trillion worth of prize goods. In fact, I'm not even sure what you could fit in a warship that would add up to a total value of 2 trillion. I mean, it's the modern equivalent probably of a Royal Navy warship showing up somehow having managed to Shanghai every single share, deed, source of income, ownership, directorship and board membership of the entirety of Apple, and just gone, right, this is ours now, somehow. So yeah, Drake's, in terms of absolute value relative to the economy, was probably the single most valuable one. We mentioned Captain Pellew and HMS Indefatigable already, but individually, the one that's usually held to be the biggest individual haul, i.e. we captured one ship and it was worth stupid amounts of money, would probably be the capture of the Spanish frigate Hermione. Now, you might think, well, hang on a minute, why would a single 28-gun frigate be so valuable? Well, it wasn't so much the frigate itself, it was the fact that, like the Cacafuego, which Drake captured, it was a Spanish ship that happened to be full of gold and silver. So that was captured in 1762 and assessed with a total prize value of just under £520,000 at the time. Then you have to go and work out which value you're actually going to assess that by. So you can assess that by what's called the real price index, the retail price index, i.e. how much, if you look at what would nearly £520,000 buy you at that point in the 1760s, and how much would it cost you to buy those same things again these days. So you could be looking at property, houses, property, goods, that kind of thing. Now, in those terms, that's the lowest value. That suggests a total haul for a single prize of just over £78 million. However, I always feel that that is slightly unrealistic because the overall prices of commodities have changed quite radically compared to their relative value to people in times past. I personally think it's better to look at either the labour value of that money, i.e. how many standard wages does that represent, both then and now. Obviously, it represents a lot of standard wages, but if you took the standard average wage of a worker in the 1760s, and you said, right, that amounts to X percent of this almost £520,000, and then you say, okay, well, let's take the average wage in the UK now and multiply it up using that same percentage value, then that £520,000 haul is actually worth just short of £1 billion, which is not bad for a single haul, to be perfectly honest. And then your final option, which is also one I quite like, is to look at the economic share. Now, that has a perhaps more direct correlation with what Sir Francis Drake's haul was about, and effectively represents how much additional money are you injecting into the national economy with this money. So obviously a lot of this is obviously foreign source now, but that's probably proportionally a more accurate measurement, either that or the income or labour value of the money. Now, if you do that, you get a much larger figure. So £520,000 to the UK economy in 1762 is the equivalent of just under £10 billion to the UK economy these days. So that's the single biggest individual haul so far. But, as I say, there's probably a lot more results out there that could fill in the other, what we're looking for, the other 6 slots in your suggested list at that point. Daniel Silverthorne asks, do you have any examples of paravanes being used in situations that were not testing or training? I understand they were designed to be sacrificial, but how practical would this have actually been? Were they costly or difficult to produce, and how easily could they be replaced in theatre? There are many examples of paravanes being used in wartime situations. In fact, quite a lot of the time, especially when you're talking about ships deployed to more distant stations, such as, say, the Eastern Fleet in the mid part, really, of World War II, you can see in their logs quite often as they enter or leave port, there'll be an entry, streamed paravanes, or retrieved paravanes, because, okay, yeah, they're not the cheapest of things, but ships would carry more than just a pair, and compared to the cost of a battleship, using paravanes to sweep for mines, which was their more common use by World War II after the initial attempts to use them as an anti-submarine weapon in World War I kind of went away. That minesweeping role, when you don't have full-on minesweepers, even if your destroyers ahead of you are also sweeping paravanes, it's far better to do that and risk losing something that could be relatively easily replaced than risking an entire battleship running into a mine. The problem with paravanes is that to use them properly and correctly requires the ship to be travelling at a relatively slow speed, and is not the ship becomes fairly unagile. So this is why they would tend to be used on things like the approach to or leaving port, when the ship doesn't have to manoeuvre too much. It's not proceeding at any great speed, but there is a risk that, obviously, as a choke point area, it might have been mined. You can see here's a picture from World War II of a paravane actually in the process of being deployed. If you like a specific example, during the invasion of the Philippines, the invasion convoy, the amphibious attack convoy that entered Leyte Gulf, streamed paravanes from the moment it was due to enter the Gulf until they took anchor, because although there had been minesweeping efforts, they weren't 100% confident that they'd gotten all of them, or indeed that perhaps Japanese submarines might have laid more. And, well, yeah, convoy full of troops is a fairly valuable thing to protect, and so every ship involved in that operation was instructed to stream paravanes as they made their way to their assault positions within Leyte Gulf itself. Obviously, the warships that were hanging further off the coast, that were supporting with airstrikes or other things like the Taffy forces, etc., didn't have to do that so much, but the invasion convoy itself was 100% paravanes in order to avoid any losses. As it turned out, they didn't actually run into any mines with the paravanes, but they did deploy them. Clay Ramsey asks, I recently saw a video of HMS Rodney on YouTube exiting port. Below the rows of portholes on her side, in the middle of the armour belt, was an overboard discharge of water. Was it common for armour belts to be penetrated with things such as this? I believe I've seen the same footage that you are referring to, and no, generally a ship's armour belt is not pierced with bilge pumps or scuttles. But with Rodney and Nelson in particular, along with some US battleships, there's a slightly different story to it, because as you can see here from this cross-section, rather than having the belt armour on the exterior, which would involve their scuttle piercing the belt armour, Rodney, along with Hood, was one of some of the earliest adopters of internal sloping belt armour, the same kind of thing you see on the South Dakota and Iowa class battleships. And so what you're seeing there in the kind of blank sections of the hull is plating that is forward of the armour belt, but is not in fact itself the armour belt. And so you can have pumps and scuttles running up to or down to that outer hull plating to discharge water overboard without actually piercing the main belt itself. Richard Goss asks, could Courageous and Glorious have given valuable service in World War II if they'd been up-armoured and retained, much like Hood, as a one-off? In the Washington Naval Treaties, if we keep their designation as large light cruisers, thus they don't eat into capital ship tonnage. To be honest, I severely doubt it. Their hulls have a lot of problems already, and adding more armour to that increases the stress at various points in the ship. I mean, technically the armour might act as some form of support for the amidship section, but, using your ship's armour, the thing that is designed to, get broken if it gets hit by shells, as part of the main structural element of your ship doesn't seem to be the wisest engineering approach, unless you really like your ship just folding up like a wet towel as the minute it gets hit. So, I mean, there's that problem. I really don't think the hulls could withstand any kind of up-armouring to a point where they might be of practical use. Secondly, adding any substantial portion of armour, even if the hull is capable of taking that protection, would require increasing the ship's overall displacement and reducing the ship's overall speed. So they'd go from 32 knots probably way down. You're never going to get enough armour on these ships to make them valuable as, anything to do with anti-capital ship work. And even if you, again, somehow magically did, they don't have the firepower. Yes, they have 15-inch guns. They only have 4 of them. Renown was confident enough to go chasing after the 2 Scharnhorsts, but it had 6 guns. Okay, fair enough. It was only being able to use 4 most of the time, but that's still, 50% more overall firepower and double the applicable firepower that a Courageous class could bring into play, as well as, issues with salvo strength, etc., that I've discussed previously. And with the reduced speed that you'd have as a result of up-armouring the ships, they wouldn't have the kind of speed that Renown did in that engagement either. So then they'd no longer be fast enough to run away from the more modern warships, and they wouldn't have the firepower to stand up to those warships. They also wouldn't have the firepower to stand up to a lot of older warships either. So even something like, say, a Britannia-class battleship, if Vichy France had decided to go to war, although a Courageous would still be able to outrun it, the Britannia would outgun it quite significantly. And looking at, say, the Italian modernised ships, the Conte di Cavour and Duilio class, okay, their individual guns are of a lesser calibre, but they're better protected. They would be probably about as fast, and they've got a lot more guns. Though 4 guns is really just not good enough, so you can rule out that as well. The Italian ships would almost certainly win that engagement. Pretty much the only thing you'd actually get any use out of them for would be maybe if you could up armor them to 5 or 6 inch belts, and then maybe they'd act as cruiser killers. But even doing that, as I said, would reduce their speed, so they wouldn't be able to kill most cruisers, because most cruisers could just run away from them, and you'd still have issues hitting. I mean, the 15-inch gun will wreck cruisers that it hits, but again, 4 guns, you're going to be really hard-pressed to actually hit anything with them. About the only thing I can really see them having any particular viable use against would be the Deutschland class, because the Deutschland class are a bit slower, so they can't run away from them, and then it's kind of maybe a battle of glass cannons, because even if you've got 5 or 6 inch armour belts on the Courageous class, it's not going to really help you against the 11-inch guns of the German ships at most ranges. Granted, the German ships' armour is not going to protect it from 15-inch gunfire either, and the 15-inch gun is somewhat longer range and retains armour penetration at longer ranges, so they'd have an advantage in that situation, but that's an incredibly niche role. And the minute the Deutschland class disappear off of the Atlantic scene, you're left with a ship that basically cannot catch anything that it's able to kill, and it can't run away from anything that can kill it, except for a few really obsolete battleships, which really doesn't stand them in very good stead. So I would say the conversion to carriers, even though Courageous and Glorious are lost pretty early on, was still probably the best use you could have made of them. And that brings us to the end of the Drydock for this week. Thank you very much for listening. No particular channel admin this week, other than to note that, of course, I will be at the Chalk Valley History Festival in but Broad Chalk near Salisbury next weekend. So over the course of that weekend, if you can find me at the medieval section, I'll be glad to talk to you. Other than that, I will see you all again in another video.